Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Understanding Your Community, Getting to Know the People Behind the Buzz. I'm Jasmine, I'm our Product Marketing Manager here at Brandwatch.
I'm Glenn, I'm the Head of Product here at Brandwatch.
So for those of you who came to our webinar last month, you know this is the second of our monthly webinar series. So last month we talked all about influencers, and today we're going to talk more about almost the opposite, so the other people in your audience who are talking about your brand online. We've just launched our new demographics feature, so particularly focusing on demographics and why those are useful and how they can be helpful. So we'll talk a bit through some of those ideas, and then we'll have a live demo from Glenn showing how you can get some really cool information using demographics. And then we'll take some of your questions at the end and have a short Q&A. So please do get involved. Feel free to ask questions in the session chat box, and we'll get to them at the end. Don't worry if we don't get to your question in the session. We'll always follow up with you afterwards with an email if we don't manage to. You can also tweet us at Brandwatch and use a hashtag BrandwatchTips. We'll be sending out a copy of this presentation and a recording of the webinar within a few days so that you can watch again or share with people. So you'll notice that the title of the webinar is Understanding Your Community. I wanted to talk a bit about what a community is. Obviously, traditionally, it's a community of people living together who have a particular interest, like these elephants. But when we talk about online communities, people often think of things like forums or maybe your own communities, like your own Facebook page. But when we talk about community for this, we're talking about people online who are discussing your brand. They have the shared common interest of your brand. They might not all know each other and they might not all be talking to each other, but they all have that shared commonality between them. And we think you should know a bit more about those people. So why are demographics useful? Well, demographics, as you probably all know, have been used in market research for a very long time, and that's because they tell you lots more about people. So while we get lots of data and numbers, finding out about the people behind that conversation is really important.
Yeah, and it's something we get asked about at Brandwatch a lot of the time. People want to know more about the people behind the conversation, not just the actual conversation itself, which is why we've been developing our own demographics features that we launched last week.
So we wanted to give a couple of real-life examples of where demographics has actually been useful, especially in terms of things like marketing and product development. So this is a bit of a social media folklore tale that gets bandied about, but this is all about Sony e-readers. So when Sony first started releasing their e-readers, they thought that because it was a gadgety tech item, it would be of interest to people who traditionally were interested in gadgety tech items. So generally that is young males. So they designed their products to focus on that audience and also their marketing to surround it. And you can see on this picture here that there's an e-reader here that's got quite a lot of buttons, looks quite gadgety. It's not like the ones we have these days, they're much more simplified. So they started to target that audience, but then when they looked online, they found that people talking about e-readers were actually women and mothers and older women. So this was a whole audience that they hadn't even considered would be a target market for them. And as a result, they started to change their products. They made them in different colours, sort of softened the lines, made them more simple to use, and also changed their marketing so that it would target that audience. So that's just one example of how demographics can be really useful.
Yeah, and this is something that we've had experience with other clients as well. So the reason I've got this picture here is because we worked with a car insurance firm in the UK a while ago, and their typical kind of customer was the family, people that wanted to insure multiple cars, and they had a few policies that worked very well for them. And they came to us and they wanted to know more about what people said about them online. And what we found is there are a huge amount of people talking about how good they were for modified cars, hence this picture here, because they had a good policy for kind of unique vehicles. And that was something they weren't really aware of, how kind of popular that conversation was. They didn't even have a landing page for that product on their website. So by understanding their audience, they're able to kind of create search terms, create a landing page, create campaigns around this product they had that had an audience online they didn't even know about.
So what can demographics actually tell you? So in terms of what we've just discussed. It can find you new or unexpected audiences or target markets. So people discussing your brand or your product, or even not necessarily yours, but competitors or products within your industry that you can then start to target. They can also tell you more about the interests and professions of your audience. So this is my Twitter profile. As you can see, I'm particularly into cakes and baking. So that's something that, if you know that about me, you know that I'm going to be interested in that kind of content, and you can then target your content better to those audiences. You can also then understand which of that content is resonating and with who. You might find that some of your campaigns particularly were well received by women, whereas others were better received by men. Or that those interested in tech, for example, were particularly interested in that content. And obviously this is Obama's tweet, which resonated with quite a lot of people. But it need not necessarily be tweets. It can be anything that you're putting out, whether that be online or something like an advert. And then that conversation filters onto the online world. And you can also then understand the topics of conversation within those different groups. So why is it being more shared by women? What is it about that campaign that they're discussing? How is that different to how men are discussing it? Or how is that different to students or journalists? So you can really get more of an insight into what those people are talking about, why it's been successful or unsuccessful, and who you can target and how you can better target them in the future.
So at Brandwatch, we were looking at this. We started with some of the kind of core demographics that we could get out of social profiles. So we started with Twitter, so we pull out things like gender and professions and interests based on people's names, their bios, and the location information that they give us.
When you're talking about the online world, it's difficult to get all of the demographic type segments that are traditional in market research, so things like age and salary. Most people aren't going to put their salary in their Twitter bio. So we obviously have to be aware of the limitations of what we can get with online data, and that's something to always bear in mind when you're analysing social data. And often we find that usually you should meld the two and look at various different types of data and use them all together.
Yeah, definitely. But it's important to understand the difference and the advantages of both, as we'll kind of talk about more in a second.
Yeah, so on that note, Glenn's now going to switch over to Brandwatch and show you a few live examples of how you can use this.
So yeah, I'm going to take you for a quick demo of Brandwatch and our demographics features. Now, there's plenty of other tools out there, and there's plenty with other kinds of demographic type functionality. I'm going to use Brandwatch because, surprisingly, it's the one I know best. So we're going to look at House of Cards. For those that don't know, it's a kind of piece of Netflix original content. It's a political drama starring Kevin Spacey that I like a lot. So I fit quite neatly into this demographic here. So we can see straight away that the main audience for this is males over females, although there's a significant amount of females there. And we can see a kind of big uptake recently. That's when the show launched. And below we kind of have a summary of some interests, professions, and the countries where the audience comes from. And we'll look at those in a bit more depth now. So if I first look at gender comparisons, this is the same kind of chart you were looking at just now. But what I've done is I put two side by side, and this left one is filtered by males. So one of the things we can do in Brandwatch is we have this huge list of filters that allows you to customize your data. And I've selected here to customize and filter this one just by men, and the right-hand side just by women. So now I can kind of understand all of the differences between the interests, the professions, and the countries of those two genders. And it's surprising some of the differences you notice. So men are much more interested in sport, or men who talk about House of Cards in sport than more interested in books and family and parenting, and that allows you to understand the kind of differences in those demographic segments. And we'll kind of talk a bit more about why that's interesting in a second. We look at the professions, then we see pretty much the same professions across the board, so it's appealing to the same kind of job areas, and same with the countries as well. And if we look below that, what this chart is showing here is we're comparing topics, but by female to male. So things on the right here are conversations that men are talking about more, and on the right, female. And there's a couple of things that stand out. So one is Robin Wright. She's one of the female leads in the show, much more talked about by females than males. So you can see that's kind of more appealing to that side of things. We also see a competition from Roku appearing more for females than males. And the right-hand side, males more talking about kind of the first episode or the season, or some of the male characters like Kevin Spacey. Barack Obama's not in the show, but obviously appealing more to the male audience. let's have a look at interest then. So as we saw earlier, sports were one of the top interests we saw, obviously mainly dominated towards men. And this is one of the kind of default charts, but this one below in Brandwatch is one we've customized just for this to kind of show you a bit more about House of Cards. And this is a chart component in Brandwatch where I can kind of compare any two pieces of data. So I'm just looking at the volume of interests, but I could equally look at gender or, well, all manner of kind of options. And one of the cool things here is we can kind of dive down and understand the conversation a bit better. So sports was something we identified earlier, and I can look at that and I can see what the conversation around sports are for House of Cards, or people that like sports who talk about House of Cards. And we can see there's no kind of clear mention in here of sports and House of Cards, so there's no kind of correlation between those two. But that doesn't really matter. What's important to understand is that if sports is such a popular area of interest for the audience, maybe that would be a good place to target, maybe in terms of advertising House of Cards during the Super Bowl or other sporting events would be really useful for this audience. But we can also try and find places where there's maybe a bit more correlation between the interest, the conversation, and the show. So if we look at politics, we start seeing a little bit more kind of political related stuff. So I scroll down a bit here, we'll see people talking about political dramas, we talk about people talking about the politics in House of Cards, the monologues, types of conversation that go on, democracy being overrated. And if I scroll further down for this list, there's some other conversations about how this relates to other political dramas like the West Wing or Barack Obama, and you start seeing actually there is a very strong correlation, unsurprisingly, right, between a political show and people that like politics, but they talk about it in a political context, whereas people that like sports don't talk about it in a sport context. And understanding that is really important in terms of your targeting. And below we have a similar kind of comparison to the male-female one we looked at earlier, but this time we're comparing politics, people interested in politics on the left, and people interested in movies on the right. And you start seeing people that like politics are more likely to talk about political shows, or they're more likely to talk about other political shows like the West Wing, and they talk about Barack Obama, and they want to talk about the sort of politics side of things. And then the far right side, we're seeing people talking more about the actors involved, obviously because they're more interested in movies. And that's really key, again, in understanding how you would target those different groups of people. And below here, what we've got is a list of authors. So these are our top kind of influencers in politics, talking about House of Cards, and top people who are interested in movies in House of Cards.
Yeah, and what's really great in Brandwatch is that you can add to author lists. So you can look at each of these authors and then compile lists of those people. So, for example, we want to find people who are just interested in movies and make a list of influential people interested in movies. Or maybe you want to create a list of women who are interested in sport who tweet about House of Cards. So you can build up those lists and then use them over time. You can filter all of the different charts by those lists, track what those people are talking about, their specific topics of conversation, and then further nurture your relationship with them by improving your understanding and your targeting of them.
Yeah, and slicing the data like that is really important. So we could go back to any of those charts we've just looked at, like the gender ones, and say, I want to see that view, but just by this group of 50 people I've identified as important, and really understand what interests them, so you can target those people specifically. To look at one interest in a bit more depth, or a profession, I should say. We looked at various professions. One that was quite interesting was looking at people who work in software and IT and what they talk about in relation to House of Cards. And they talk about some of the same things everyone else talks about, the show and Netflix and the actors, but a few things stand out that are quite interesting. So one is Windows Phone is talked about, and that's a bit of product placement in the show. And people that like software and IT a bit don't really like the Windows Phone, it seems, and aren't really impressed by the main guy using Windows Phone in the show. But that's interesting to know that it doesn't appeal to them, and maybe in future product placement, targeting something different would appeal to their audience, or maybe you find the Windows Phone will appeal to some of those other audiences we looked at. And there's one thing that's stand out here that you don't see elsewhere. So Cards Against Humanity is a slightly geekier game. I know a lot of people around the office here like it, especially in the IT team. So you can see they did a crossover with House of Cards there that might be interesting to look at. As mentioned, we cover things like professions as well. We cover locations, but in the interest of brevity, we'll kind of move past those. So the final bit of analysis I want to show you and talk about is we're looking at the UK versus US. Earlier we identified that as the key two markets that are most talked about for House of Cards. And you can see the US conversation is way bigger than the UK conversation. Not too surprisingly, it's a US political drama, and the US market is much bigger. And below here, what we've done is create a topics lab for people from the UK and people from the US to look at what they talk about and what's different between the two. And a couple of things you'll notice on the left-hand side for the UK, people talking about Netflix UK, people talking about Howard Webb, who's an English football referee, talking about Kevin Spacey and kind of UK-related things. But on the right-hand side, we see things more related to the American ones. So there's that competition again, only open to American users. We also see this Dream of What Government, which is an article written by the New York Times, which is related to talking about how the West Wing and House of Cards differ in talking about politics and relation to the US government. And obviously that's a piece of content that only really resonated with the US audience because from the UK's point of view, I imagine they're less interested in the actual kind of details of US politics. But we can kind of cross-compare, like I was saying earlier. So here we start looking at what do the US and UK people think by gender. And we can see in the UK, males, again, most popular watching House of Cards, talking about House of Cards, and females less so. In America, a much higher proportion of the conversations from females. And we can assume that's mostly because the show will be more appealing to the American audience as it's more related to American politics, and therefore has a slightly more even split than over here. And again, looking below here, this is a bit of custom kind of analysis we've done. So one of the great things of Brandwatch is being able to kind of break down by any way you want to slice and dice the data. So we've created some custom analysis points here around the actors involved. So Kevin Spacey, Mark Kelly, and Robin Wright are three of the key actors. And we see Kevin Spacey dominates the conversation both sides of the pond, and that is a really interesting story if you look into House of Cards more and how Netflix devised it. One thing they found from looking at their own audience statistics with tools like Brandwatch and their own usage is they saw that Kevin Spacey was hugely popular in their audience, and that's why they chose him as the lead role, and that shows very clearly in the conversation about all the main actors in the show. But also interestingly, we see a much larger proportion of people in the US talking about Robin Wright. I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where females resonated more with that character and talked about it more, and the higher proportion of females in the American audience that talk about the show. So we see a much higher proportion of people in the US talking about Robin Wright.
Yeah, and if you break that chart down by gender rather than country, you can see that women do talk about Robin Wright much more, obviously identifying with a sort of strong female lead.
And that's really interesting when you think about how that could affect your targeting and your placement of things and the content you produce, and understanding how all these different things interoperate between interest, profession, location, and then some custom analysis of your own to really understand the different audience needs, desires, and interests.
Great, so that's some real life examples of how you can actually use it to find out this, in this instance, about House of Cards. So we're going to go through some of your questions now. So as I said at the beginning, sorry if we don't get to your question, we've got quite a lot. I'll try and get through as many as possible. And also we've been told to speak up. So
speak up, okay.
Yes. So we'll follow up with you afterwards if we don't get to your question, so don't panic. So the first question was, is it possible to gather all the information in other languages like Arabic? Glenn, do you want to talk a bit about languages?
Yeah, sure. So we started with just English because it's one of the more predominant ones for us in terms of our industry and business, and obviously covers a large portion of the internet. But over time, we'll expand that into other languages, starting probably with gender and moving into the other parts of the interests as well.
And a similar question is it only available for Twitter, and are we going to expand it to other platforms?
Yeah, so at the moment it's just Twitter, and that's mainly because Twitter is just really well kind of defined. It's very easy to define. Here's the name, here's the bio. But over time, we'll expand that into other areas. So Facebook is an obvious next step for us, and then other types of social network in the future.
We also find that Twitter accounts for sort of 70% of most query volume, so it made sense for that to be the first one we looked at. Someone's asking about what percentage are classified and how accurate it is. It depends on which demographic segment you're looking at. With all of them, once we classified them, we think it's about 90 to 95% accurate. But obviously we can only categorise according to what people tell us in their bio. So if they don't have any interests, then we can't give them interests because we're only doing it based on what they tell us. But we find for interests it's about half of all authors.
About 50%.
gender, it's about 90%. For profession, it's slightly lower, so 10 to 20%. So it does vary according to the category, but feel free to get in contact and we'll give you some more details. Next question is, are the interest categories fixed or can you create your own?
Okay, that's a good question. So they are fixed in the way we've done them in there, but it's very easy to kind of customize and create your own sort of categories and rules around that. It's just a bit different to the way we support it and will require some setup your end, but it's totally doable to kind of have a more custom view of the data. These are just the ones we picked as most popular first.
Someone's pointed out that in one of the first topic clouds we showed, Kevin Spacey appeared twice. Can we explain why that anomaly came up?
I didn't see it on there. It could well be because one had a space and one didn't. It could be because it had a hashtag before it. The way that key term stuff pulls that information is it's looking for sort of key terms that are appearing a lot. So Kevin Spacey without a space and Kevin Spacey with a space would be classed as different by the system. I guess Kevin Spacey without a space is just Kevin Y.
So they've also asked location data. Is it restricted to country or can you go down to region and city?
Yeah, you can. You can go all the way down to region and city. And we do that on a mentioned basis, so where the actual mention took place and where the author sort of mainly inhabits. But they tend to be mostly the same, but it is sometimes different, obviously, people on holiday and that kind of thing.
Someone's also asked how we calculate those location details.
Yeah, it's quite comprehensive, really. There's a number of ways we do it. So there's stuff we get out of the bio. People tell us, you know, I'm from London, UK, or whatever, and we'll take that. Other times we'll take time zone. Sometimes people put a location piece of data on the individual tweet. So we kind of try and cover all those areas. It's not always 100% because some people will tell us they're from the moon or they'll tell us they're from somewhere else. You know, if someone just puts London, we can probably assume they're from UK, but there are other Londons around the world. So yeah, so we try to. It's fairly accurate there, I'd say.
Someone's asked if you could break down the conversation. So, for example, by women about Robin Wright, by their sentiment. And yes, we're obviously just showing one element of Brandwatch here, which is the demographics, but we do lots of other types of analysis, including sentiment analysis. And you can incorporate that into all those charts when you set them up. Yeah,
the chart stuff I was showing earlier with the kind of lots of interest in a line, you can kind of split that in multiple ways. So you could look at, as you say, sentiment versus that type of conversation and see the breakdown.
Someone's asked, isn't it odd that the top profession watching House of Cards is artists? It doesn't seem to match reality. Maybe if you explain a bit about that artist category.
Yeah, artist is quite a kind of broad category for us. It's one of the more broader ones. So like politics doesn't appear there, but artist includes. It's one of the more harder ones to categorize because the way people often describe themselves, it covers sort of some of the musician side of things as well. So when people talk about some of that, it appears through there.
And there also seems to be a thing that people who are artists or designers and stuff have a tendency to state that more often than people in other interests. So a high proportion of people might be.
There's also a reasonably high proportion of students involved, and when looking for the data, a kind of more artistic slant, some of them. So that showed through. What was interesting is we didn't really see politics appear as a profession. So it was an interest, but not as a profession. And I think that's probably because there just aren't as many politicians as there are other types of profession talking about it.
So someone's asked, does that mean we don't support Arabic analysis? No, we do support Arabic. We just don't support it for this demographics feature at the moment. Demographics is only available for people with English language bios, but we do everything else in Arabic. Do we pull information from private profiles or is it only public profiles?
Only public. I mean, with all of Brandwatch, we only focus on publicly available data. We don't collect any from private from anyone. So it's all kind of above board in that regard.
Someone's asked what demographic info besides gender can you track?
So we have gender, we have location, we have interests, professions, and we also know if the Twitter user is an individual or an organisation. So you can look at just businesses talking about a particular topic or just the individuals.
Someone's asked, is location ever going to be available on Facebook?
Good question. Yes, in the future it will be. It's a harder thing to do, and because a lot of the time that information is private, we don't want to touch it. It's only if people declare it publicly, and not as many people on Facebook publicly declare information such as location in the way they do on Twitter. So we will gather more of that information in the future, but we're always careful to make sure that we're gathering only public data.
Someone's asked about the top authors being just tweeters, so that sort of links back to what we were saying before. Yes, at the moment it's only Twitter data. Someone's also asked if we can determine interest by the tweets rather than just the bio. I think the answer is we could, but we haven't due to testing.
Yeah, so we started with the bio because it's just a really efficient way, and we found it was really accurate. We got quite a lot out of it. When you start going into the actual tweets, you start seeing much more it's much harder to kind of get a definitive answer on someone's interests and professions. Or like if you tweet about sport for a couple of times in one day and then don't for months, does that mean you're interested in sport? That's why we went with the bio, because it's a much kind of more definitive way of someone saying, here's who I am, here's what I like. And looking at it based on their tweets just requires just kind of a higher level precision that we weren't really seeing there. So
a good example of that would be the sort of Lance Armstrong news story. Obviously, it was a big story and loads of people talked about it all the time. And if we were just analysing tweets, we might then say all those people are interested in sports, when actually they're probably not that interested in sports. It just happens to be a very topical news story at that time. Someone has said, is there a way of weighting responses by clout?
Weighting response by clout? We don't have clout in the system for that thing, but we do have cred, and we do have our own impact score. So those things will be weighted. And the author list we showed you earlier was actually ordered by our impact score, and that looks at things like followers, the amount of tweets they made, the amount of interactions they had with your brand, their kind of cred scores, which looks at other metrics as well. So we're trying to cover kind of quite a wide range of metrics and come up with what we think a person's kind of impact is for your brand or topic.
I'll go through two more questions in the time we've got left. So someone's asked, is there a free trial? Yeah. We'll follow up with you afterwards and set up a trial for you and arrange a trial. If you'd like one and haven't requested one already, then feel free to get in touch, and we'll let you know our contact details on screen now. And the last question is, can we capture what time of day the tweets go out?
Well, we capture all the data with the mentions, so we know you can kind of view their stuff, and you can break the mentions down by hour, so you can kind of get a much clearer idea of when that stuff is going on. And there'll be more support for that in the future to kind of let you do more interesting things with time.
Yeah.
But we cover quite a granular range of stuff.
Someone's also asked about channels. Our channels feature is a separate feature. We'll follow up with you afterwards and give you some more details about that. So unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. If you have any more questions, then do feel free to get in touch with us on any one of those channels that you can see now, and we'll be happy to get back to you. And as I said, we'll send out a recording and the presentation by the beginning of next week. Thank you very much for joining us.